Yeah, so my talk is indeed about motives and where we can find them. So this is joint work with Remco van der Hofstad and Johan van Leeuwarden. So motives have indeed, as Frank already mentioned, been around for quite a while. I think around 20 years by now. So some 20 years ago, some researchers started investigating motives. So they looked at some. I think the first network that was investigated was some gene interaction network, and some researchers started counting how often different types of subgraphs appeared in that network. And they found that one particular subgraph appeared much more often than other subgraphs. And it was, in this case, this one, which they called the feed-forward loop. And then, of course, other researchers also started investigating different types of networks, and they found that in different types of networks, there are often different subgraphs that appear very often. So that's very interesting because different types of networks have different types of subgraphs. So then the assumption was, well, probably these subgraphs also have something to do with the particular function that this structure has in a network. And then these subgraphs that appear very frequently in one particular network, they are often called motifs. And a lot of research has been done about motifs, and also very interesting useful uses of these motifs have been found in various applications. So, for example, a recent application studied the application of these motifs in social media. And some researchers recently found that some particular subgraphs or motifs can be associated with the presence of trolls in a particular part of the network for some reason. And another application is that in networks that encode the interaction between genes and proteins, some researchers also found that these two motifs that are highlighted here, that they have some correlation between being present in a network and having genes with cancer mutations on them. So finding these particular subgraphs that appear more often than you would expect is very interesting because it can lead to very valuable information about all kinds of network data sets. But of course, suppose you have some network and you want to know, is a triangle, is that a motif or not? And let's say you find that the triangle appears 100 times in that network. Then how do you conclude if this is more than you would expect or maybe not? And usually people find out if a triangle or any other kind of subgraph is a motif by comparing this network to benchmark networks. So these are null models, random graph models that generate networks that should be somewhat similar to the original data set, so that they actually can serve as a benchmark for that data set. And very frequently, the configuration model is used as a benchmark model. So this configuration model actually creates random network models with the same degrees as your original data set. So by using that configuration model, or sometimes the erased configuration model, which makes sure you don't have multiple connections or self-loops, you can generate many other networks that should be somewhat similar to your data, and then you can count triangles in those networks, and you can see is the amount of triangles I had in my data set, is that more than what I expect based on this null model or not? But of course, it would be very useful if you just have an expression for how often you expect a subgraph to appear in this null model, instead of that you have to generate many networks and start doing all this subgraph count in all these benchmark networks. So it would also be useful if you just have some knowledge of how often do we expect a subgraph to appear in a configuration model, because then you can easily compare it to a data set and conclude whether it's a lot or not. So we started actually by investigating how often do you find some particular subgraph in a configuration model on a specific number of vertices. But it turns out that this is actually not a very easy question. But surprisingly, we found out that if you ask a more detailed question, so the question, where in a network does a specific graph appear as a subgraph in a configuration model, that question is actually easier to answer, and it gives you more detailed information. And and it also allows you to then answer how often do we expect a subgraph to appear. So what do we mean by where? Well, suppose you find this particular small subgraph you're interested in somewhere in your configuration model. And of course, this small subgraph is part of a very large network. So you can then find out, okay, on which vertices do I find this subgraph? And specifically, what are the degrees of those vertices on which I find the subgraph? And it turns out that for every subgraph, there is some sort of optimal degree on which you find it almost always in this benchmark model. So we can actually predict where in a network do specific subgraphs appear most frequently. And you can use this information then to also count them. And specifically, we focus on one particular type of configuration model. We focus on configuration models where the degree distribution has a power law degree distribution. So that means that the fraction of vertices that has degree k follows the equation that I wrote down here on the slide. And this is a degree distribution that's often found to be a good approximation of many real network data sets, or where they also have a power law degree distribution. So basically what a power law degree distribution means is that you will have, if you plot the degrees, then you will see that you will have many, many vertices that have very low degree, so that in this case that have 10 connections or less. But you will also find a few vertices that have a huge degree. So in this case of approximately 1,000. So many vertices have low degree, but some vertices have extremely high degree. And because of this, we have a very wide range of possible degrees. So what we then did is we split the network into different parts based on the degrees. So you have the network, and then you split the network into small boxes of vertices with approximately a similar degree. And then you optimize over all these different colored boxes, and you find out how often does a specific type of subgraph I'm interested in, how often does it appear between these different boxes, or maybe within these boxes. So as an example of that, suppose we're again interested in triangles, one of the simplest subgraphs. Then you can investigate how often does a triangle appear between vertices of the degrees, in this case, n to the power alpha 1, n to the power alpha 3, and n to the power alpha 2, where n is your network size for some values of alpha 1, alpha 2, and alpha 3. So for example, if you choose alpha 1 equals a half, then you look at vertices that have degree approximately square root. And then we can show that this is actually, you can also approximate this number of triangles between vertices of these three different boxes of degrees. You can approximate that by the number of vertices that have such degrees times how often they actually form a triangle together. And now the first term, so we have this number of vertices of different degrees, then this blue term, you can see that that is actually decreasing in the vertex degrees. And that is because of the power law degree distribution. So because if you have a very high degree vertices, there are not so many of them. So this term is decreasing the higher you make the degrees of the vertices in those boxes. But then the second term, the green term, so that is a probability that vertices of specific degrees form a triangle together, that is actually increasing in the degree. Because the more connections you have, the more subgraphs you can participate in, because you just have many more opportunities to collaborate in different subgraphs. So one term is increasing, the other one is decreasing. So this suggests that there may be some optimal way to form a triangle. And if you write out all the equation, then it turns out that yes, indeed, there is an optimal way to form a triangle. And that is a triangle where all vertices have degree square root n. So that means square root n, if you have n vertices in your graph, the optimal way to form a triangle in a configuration model is between 3 vertices of degree approximately square root n. So what we can show is that actually, so if you go to a very big network, then actually it's actually maybe even stronger than that. Then these vertices of degree square root n are approximately all triangles. Of course, there will also be triangles between vertices of different degree, but as your network becomes very large, they only contribute they just contribute a very negligible fraction of the triangle count. So basically, if you have a large configuration model and you throw away all vertices that do not have degree approximately square root n, you can still count triangles and still be precise on your triangle count. And using this, we can then also find an expression for the triangle count in this configuration model. So triangles appear at vertices of intermediate degree, you could say. But of course, triangles are just one type of subgraph, but we can do the exact same procedure for different subgraphs. So for example, if we do the same procedure on these subgraphs and investigate where they are most likely to occur, then the subgraph on the left, that appears usually on vertices where these light green vertices, they have degree this weird exponent, which is actually smaller than square root n. And the blue ones, so these ones, they appear on vertices which have degree n to the power this power, which is actually larger than square root n. So this subgraph, you also can predict where in the configuration model you are most likely to find it. So on vertices, so 2 have vertices of very high degree, 3 have vertices of lower degree, but it's not the same as for the triangle. But for example, if you look at the complete graph of size 5, this behaves similar to the triangle. So if you find this one somewhere in your network, it's very likely that all 5 vertices have degree approximately square root n. And what we can show, and then of course you could wonder, suppose now I plot, I can do this of course with 20 more subgraphs. I've shown 2 of them, but yeah, you can draw any subgraph you like and do the same analysis. But you can wonder, okay, so here we saw the square root n, we saw this weird exponent, this other weird exponent. How many different types of exponents can appear? But surprisingly, actually, there are only 4 of them. So we can show that in a configuration model, subgraphs, almost all subgraphs, only appear on vertices with these 4 orders of magnitude. So this exponent that also was the blue vertices, square root n, which was for the triangles and for the complete graph, and also this exponent, which was in here, and then sometimes also vertices of degree 1, 2, 3, so very small degree. These are actually the only 4 orders of magnitude that matter. So that's very interesting because it also means that in this configuration model, a very large part of your network does not contribute to any subgraph count. Basically, anything that's in between here or in between here or in between here does not contribute to triangle count, but also not to this count or to some other subgraph you could draw. So by using this knowledge that there are only 4 orders of magnitude that can contribute, we can also write an optimization problem that actually finds what is the most likely way to find a specific subgraph. And well, the exact shape of this optimization problem is not very interesting, I would say, but what is very nice is that you can easily make very nice pictures with it. They're not as nice as the pictures in the previous talk, but I still like them very much. So here you see all subgraphs of size 5, and you see in the picture where in the configuration model you are most likely to find them. So for example, here the complete graph, they almost always appear on vertices of degree square root n, as we saw before. And these ones as well. But you can see that here there are some that have some different orders of magnitude of vertices in them. And one sort of trend that you can see is that if you have very dense subgraphs, so subgraphs with a lot of connections, then these are usually likely to include a lot of square root n vertices. But if you have some vertices if you have subgraphs that have fewer connections, they usually also include several of these lower degree vertices. And this is again because of this trade-off that we already saw in the triangle part. Because on the one hand, it's very beneficial to have low degree vertices in your subgraph because there are just many, many low degree vertices and there are only a few high degree vertices. So if you have low degree vertices in a subgraph, of course, you have many opportunities to find such vertices. But on the other hand, of course, low degree vertices only have a few connections. So they are not very likely to contribute to very dense subgraphs with a lot of connections, just because low degree vertices do not have so many connections. So there's this trade-off that high degree vertices are rare, but they can participate in many subgraphs, and low degree vertices are abundant, but they do not contribute in so many subgraphs. And for dense subgraphs, this trade-off is won by some middle ground of square root n. And with subgraphs with fewer connections, then this trade-off apparently is won by the lower degree vertices. But as you can see, just changing the shape of your subgraph a little bit can change where in the network you are most likely to find it. So it's a very subtle trade-off, you could say. So to conclude, we investigated subgraphs of configuration model, which are often used as benchmark for real networks. And we find that by trying to answer how many subgraphs there are, we also find that you can actually also predict where in a network you can find them. And subgraphs localize themselves on vertices of very specific degrees, which is very interesting. Another interesting thing, which I also found very surprising, is that you can only basically have 4 different orders of magnitude that contribute to any type of subgraph count. So these, I think, are very nice results on the configuration model. But of course, the inspiration for Motifs is also from real-world data. And so you could wonder, does this phenomenon also happen on real-world data? So I do not really have an answer to that. I only have one plot to show you. But here you can see, again, this triangle, this simplest subgraph of the triangle. I think this was a Wikipedia network. And here you see the degrees. So the degrees are in bins. And a triangle is counted here. So that this is the amount of triangles that have a vertex of a specific degree in it. And you see that, again, there is some middle ground. So these are logarithmic scales. So here in the middle, with vertices that have degrees somewhere in the middle, they contribute most to the triangle count, which for some reason also seemed to happen in the configuration model. So I think this is a very interesting avenue that could be interesting to see if in all kinds of data set, if this localization phenomenon that subgraphs appear on very specific locations also appears in practice. So I would say that that's an interesting question for further research. Another question, of course, is we investigated the configuration model, which is one benchmark model. But of course, you could also go to more realistic models, even where you include some time maybe, or geometry, or all kinds of things that you could introduce to make your model more realistic. So so investigating subgraph counts is very interesting, but sometimes there's even more than you can get out of it by also looking at where you can find these subgraphs.